The rain poured down heavily, soaking the city streets. As Maria clutched her two little children close to her, her clothes were damp, her hands trembling from the cold. But she didn't care about herself. Her only concern was the two small faces looking up at her, their eyes filled with hunger and exhaustion. It had been 2 days since they'd had a proper meal, and tonight, the pangs of hunger were unbearable. She had tried everything, asking for work, offering to clean, but no one seemed to care. And now, she had no choice but to swallow her pride and ask for help. Across the street, the bright lights of an upscale restaurant gleamed like a beacon of hope. Inside, wealthy diners laughed over expensive meals, their plates overflowing with food. The smell of freshly baked bread and sizzling steak filled the air, making Maria's stomach tighten. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside, her heart pounding. The moment she entered, the chatter seemed to dim. The restaurant was grand. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Soft classical music played in the background, and every table was occupied by people who had never known what it meant to go to bed hungry. She hesitated for a moment before spotting a man sitting at the center of the restaurant, a man whose presence commanded attention. Mr. Donovan, a millionaire, a businessman, and a man known for his sharp suits and even sharper words. He was surrounded by colleagues, enjoying a lavish dinner, discussing deals worth millions, as though they were mere pocket change. His laughter echoed through the room as waiters rushed to fulfill his every order. Maria hesitated, but the image of her children's empty stomachs gave her courage. Slowly she approached his table, her voice barely above a whisper. "Excuse me, sir. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to meet his cold gaze. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but my children haven't eaten in 2 days. If you could spare just a plate of food for them, I would be so grateful." For a moment, silence filled the space around them. Mr. Donovan set his glass of wine down and looked her up and down, a smirk creeping onto his face. The people at his table exchanged glances, some amused, others indifferent. Then, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, he chuckled. "A plate of food," he repeated, leaning back in his chair. "So you think you can just walk into a place like this, beg, and expect a free meal?" His words were slow, deliberate, and dripping with condescension. "This isn't a charity, lady. If you can't afford to feed your kids, maybe you should have thought about that before having them." A few people at nearby tables chuckled under their breath, while others simply looked away, pretending not to notice the humiliation unfolding in front of them. Maria felt her cheeks burn, her hands tightening around the fabric of her worn-out coat. She opened her mouth to say something, to explain, but the weight of their stares made her words stick in her throat. Mr. Donovan sighed dramatically and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and held it between his fingers. "Tell you what," he said, waving it in front of her. "I'll give you this money, but only if you do something for me." Maria hesitated. She didn't want charity. She only wanted a meal for her children. But the sight of the money that could mean food, warmth, and even a roof over their heads for a few nights, made her desperate. "What do I have to do?" she asked quietly. His smirk widened. "Get down on your knees and beg properly," he said. "Show us how desperate you really are." The room fell into an eerie silence. The waiters stopped moving, the diners stopped eating, and all eyes were now on Maria. Some of them waited to see if she would do it, while others seemed uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. Maria's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at her children standing by the door, their small hands gripping each other. Her youngest, barely 5 years old, looked at her with confusion, not fully understanding what was happening. The older one, however, had tears welling in his eyes. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything. Would she surrender her dignity for the sake of her children? Or was there another way out? And just then, before she could decide, something unexpected happened. Maria's breath caught in her throat. The weight of Mr. Donovan's words pressed down on her like a stone, making it hard to move, hard to think. The silence in the restaurant was suffocating, thick with judgment and amusement. She could feel every set of eyes locked onto her, waiting. Some were curious, others pitiful, but none of them spoke up. No one told Mr. Donovan he had gone too far. No one defended her. Her children stood by the door, their small faces filled with confusion. Her youngest, unaware of the cruelty of the moment, only tugged at his brother's sleeve, whispering something too soft to hear. The older one, however, understood. He had seen enough of the world to know that this was wrong. His tiny fists clenched at his sides, his lips pressed together, as if he wanted to say something but didn't dare. Maria swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay strong. She had been through worse. Life had never been kind to her, but she had never begged, not like this. But her children's hunger gnawed at her heart, and the sight of the crisp bill in Mr. Donovan's hand made her stomach twist with desperation. The millionaire smirked, tapping the bill on the table, enjoying the power he held over her. His colleagues chuckled, entertained by the scene. "Come on," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Show us how much you really want it." Maria's hands trembled, but she didn't move. Instead, she took a deep breath and looked him in the eye. No. The room seemed to exhale in unison. Mr. Donovan raised an eyebrow, surprised. "No," he repeated, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. Maria straightened her back, gathering what little dignity she had left. "I came here for a plate of food for my children, not to be humiliated," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "If you won't help, I'll leave." Mr. Donovan chuckled, shaking his head. "Suit yourself," he said, slipping the bill back into his pocket. "I guess pride is more important than feeding your kids." Maria turned away, her face burning with shame. But before she could take a step, another voice cut through the air. "That's enough." The entire restaurant turned toward the source of the voice. A woman, dressed in an elegant but simple outfit, stood up from a nearby table. She was in her late 40s, her presence commanding yet warm. Her expression was firm, but there was something in her eyes that Maria recognized. Compassion. "I think we've seen enough of your cruelty. For one night, Mr. Donovan," the woman continued, walking toward Maria. "Humiliating a struggling mother doesn't make you powerful. It makes you small." The smirk on Mr. Donovan's face faltered for a brief second, but he quickly recovered. "And who exactly are you?" he asked, tilting his head. The woman ignored his question and turned to Maria instead. "Come with me," she said softly. "You and your children deserve better than this." Maria hesitated, unsure if she could trust her, but the kindness in her voice, the way she stood up against Mr. Donovan without hesitation, gave her hope. With a nod, she took her children's hands and followed the woman. As they walked out of the restaurant, whispers filled the air. Some of the diners looked ashamed, others relieved that someone had finally spoken up. Mr. Donovan, however, merely scoffed and waved for the waiter to bring him another drink, acting as if nothing had happened. Outside, the air was cool and the rain had slowed to a soft drizzle. The woman turned to Maria with a gentle smile. "My name is Evelyn," she said, "and I own a small cafe a few blocks from here. If you're willing, I'd love to offer you a warm meal, and perhaps even some work, if you're looking for it." Maria's eyes widened. You would do that for me?" Evelyn nodded. Everyone deserves a chance. And I know what it's like to struggle. I've been where you are. Tears welled in Maria's eyes. But this time, they weren't from shame or humiliation. They were from gratitude. She turned to her children, who were now smiling for the first time that evening, and she knew she had made the right choice. As they walked toward the cafe, Maria glanced back at the restaurant one last time. Mr. Donovan was still inside, laughing and drinking, oblivious to the lesson he had refused to learn. But Maria didn't care, because at that moment, she realized something. True wealth wasn't in money or status. It was in kindness, in dignity, and in the people who chose to stand by you when the world turned its back. And tonight, she had found someone who did. The walk to Evelyn's cafe was quiet, except for the occasional sniffle from Maria as she tried to hold back tears. Her children, sensing a shift in the air, clung to her hands but looked up at Evelyn with a newfound hope. For the first time that night, Maria felt something other than despair. She felt the warmth of kindness. When they reached the cafe, Maria was surprised by how cozy it was. Unlike the grand restaurant they had just left, this place felt like home. The soft glow of hanging lights, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the gentle hum of a radio playing in the background instantly eased the tension in her body. Evelyn led them to a table near the window. "Sit down," she said kindly. "I'll get you something warm." Maria hesitated. I don't have any money," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn smiled. "I didn't ask for any." A lump formed in Maria's throat as she watched Evelyn disappear into the kitchen. Her children sat eagerly, their eyes wide as they took in the smell of food filling the air. A few minutes later, Evelyn returned with 2 steaming bowls of soup and slices of warm bread. She placed them in front of the children, who wasted no time digging. Maria watched them eat, her heart aching with relief. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at Evelyn with gratitude too deep for words. Evelyn sat down across from her. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "I know what it's like to struggle, Maria. Years ago, I was in your shoes. I had nothing, no job, no home, and no one to turn to. But someone helped me when I needed it most. And now I do the same whenever I can." Maria listened, her eyes never leaving Evelyn's. "But why me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Evelyn chuckled softly. "I don't need to know your past to see the kind of person you are," she said. "You walked into that restaurant tonight, not for yourself, but for your children. And when you were given the chance to beg for money, you chose dignity instead." She paused, looking at Maria with admiration. "That says more about you than anything else." Maria felt tears sting her eyes again, but this time, she let them fall. After everything she had been through, after all the doors that had been shut in her face, someone finally saw her, not as a burden, not as a beggar, but as a person. As the children finished their meal, Evelyn leaned forward. "I meant what I said earlier," she continued. "If you're looking for work, I could use an extra pair of hands around here. It's not much, but it's honest work, and it'll help you get back on your feet." Maria's breath caught. "Work?" she repeated, as if the word itself was foreign. Evelyn nodded. "You can start tomorrow, and until you're stable, you and your kids can stay in the small apartment above the cafe. It's not fancy, but it's warm and safe." Maria could hardly believe what she was hearing. Just hours ago, she had been humiliated, hopeless, and wondering how she would make it through the night. And now, she had a job, a roof over her children's heads, and a stranger who had shown her more kindness than she had known in years. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to smile. The days turned into weeks, and Maria worked hard at the cafe. She cleaned tables, took orders, and learned how to bake under Evelyn's guidance. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something new. Her children laughed more, their cheeks fuller from the meals they never had to skip again. The dark cloud that once loomed over them had slowly begun to lift. One afternoon, as Maria wiped down the counter, the cafe door swung open, and a familiar voice rang through the space. "Well, well," Mr. Donovan smirked as he stepped inside. "Looks like you finally learned your place." The air in the cafe tensed. Maria turned, her heart steady this time. She wasn't the same woman who had stood in front of him that night, desperate and powerless. She had grown. Evelyn, who had been standing nearby, crossed her arms. "Can I help you, Mr. Donovan?" she asked, her tone firm. He chuckled, walking up to the counter. "Just came in for a coffee," he said casually, as if he hadn't tried to humiliate Maria weeks ago. "Maybe see how our little beggar is doing." Maria met his gaze, but there was no fear in her eyes now. Instead, there was strength. "I'm doing just fine," she said calmly. "And I'm no beggar." Mr. Donovan scoffed. "Oh, you're working as a waitress now. That's hardly an upgrade." Maria didn't flinch. "Maybe to you it isn't, but to me, it's everything. Because now I earn my own money with dignity. I don't have to rely on cruelty disguised as generosity." Mr. Donovan's smirk faded slightly. The cafe had gone quiet, customers watching the exchange with interest. Maria stood tall, no longer the desperate woman who had once pleaded for food. She had changed. Evelyn took a step closer, her voice unwavering. "You see, Mr. Donovan, real success isn't measured by how much money you have. It's measured by how you treat people." She paused, looking at Maria with pride. "And by that standard, Maria is richer than you'll ever be." A few customers murmured in agreement. Mr. Donovan shifted uncomfortably, his usual arrogance faltering. He scoffed, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a bill. "Here," he said, placing it on the counter. "Consider it a tip." Maria looked at the money for a long moment, then slowly pushed it back toward him. "No, thank you," she said. "I don't need it." And for the first time, Mr. Donovan had nothing to say. As he turned and walked out of the cafe, Maria felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. She had faced humiliation, hardship, and hopelessness, but she had never lost her dignity. And now, she had something far more valuable than money or status. She had a future. She had her children smiling again. And most importantly, she had people who believed in her. As she turned back to Evelyn, who smiled at her like a proud mentor, Maria knew that this was only the beginning. Life had tested her, but she had proven that no amount of wealth or power could break her spirit. Because strength wasn't about how much you had. It was about how much you refused to lose.